This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. This is Rebekkah Smith-Aldrich. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. We're very glad you can join us today to get ready for Advocacy Day, which is coming up sooner rather than later. So we want to make sure you have all the latest information of what's going on in Albany, as well as have a front row seat to making sure you understand the talking points that we're using as a library community statewide to make sure our voice is as loud as possible as we work together to advocate for library aid and legislation that impacts libraries of all types. I'm actually joined today by Jeremy Johannesen, the Executive Director of the New York Library Association. Hey, Jeremy.
Good morning, Rebekkah.
Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So as many of you know, because I can see the list of people who are on this call, you guys, a lot of you are seasoned library advocates. But for those of you who might be new to advocacy for library in New York State, what you're going to hear today is why it's so critical to speak up right now for state aid for libraries. We have until around April 1st to influence legislators and the governor to avoid was essentially a cut. He's rolled back our ads from last year, and we've got a tougher road ahead of us than you might realize. And we want to make sure you're fully aware of what's going on in Albany this year. So our goal here today is to increase your confidence about speaking up and making sure you know where to get information that will embolden you to share facts and make sure people understand the impact of the governor's proposed budget. So many of you may have been following the State of the State address by the governor, where he introduced his democracy agenda. Right after his State of the State address, he introduced his executive budget, which revealed the rollback of funding to library aid, so essentially a cut to library aid, which I don't know about you, but I found incredibly ironic. A governor that's talking about a democracy agenda cutting the most democratic institutions in New York State, which are public libraries. So while we definitely cheer him on in a lot of his efforts to help with making sure more people in New York are participating as citizens in the state and making sure there's transparency for digital political ads, we've got to make sure we're making the case that they're investing in the democratic infrastructure of New York, which is its library infrastructure. So many of you who have gone to library school are going to be familiar with our next slide, but I just wanted to make sure everybody, trustees, friends, and volunteers who also are coming out to help support library aid advocacy this year have this talking point in their toolkit for advocacy this year. Big reminder that democracy is a core value of librarianship. You cannot have a functioning democracy without an informed citizenry. And the number one spot people are going for trusted information is most likely their local library. That's where they're meeting people who actually are talking and developing ideas and solutions for the future of our communities and our state. But just the core values of librarianship, when we think about defending the First Amendment and making sure all people have the right to access information, whether it be in print or digital form, making sure everyone has the right to express their opinion and be heard. That's how we actually make democracy work, and libraries are integral to that formula. So I encourage you to get really good at talking about democracy as a core value of librarianship and make the case to our legislators and our governor that today, in today's world, where we are in our country's history, libraries have never been more important. Now is not the time to be cutting funding to library. So when we think about what we're up against this year, and I'm sure Jeremy is, actively watching this story as well, we've just recently heard that the deficit projections are quite a bit higher than expected at $2.3 billion. The state comptroller, Tom Napoli, has been interviewed in a variety of newspapers about this and says it's absolutely an unexpected and it's a sharp decline in revenues expected. And that is much due to the changes in the tax laws at the federal level, which have cut off the state and local tax deductions on your federal taxes. That means less revenue at the state level, which results in belt tightening across the line when it comes to the state budget. So you might think to yourself, well, this just sounds like what happened the last few years. The legislature gave libraries some money, the governor cuts it back the next January, the legislature puts it back in April. I think it might be a little different this year. So I'm hoping you're feeling a sense of urgency the way Jeremy and I are feeling a sense of urgency this morning on this topic. So our goal here today, we're going to break it down to the very basics of what you need to know, why you need to know it, when you need to act, who you need to speak with, and where you're going to be doing that kind of work. So I know, like I said, we've got many experienced library advocates and ambassadors on the line today, and I just want to thank you, as always, for working together on this topic. Our voices are so much stronger when we speak together, especially when it comes to advocacy work at the state level. There's many people up in Albany right now trying to be heard about their cause or their passion of what they think is so important that needs to be invested in by the state. And we are perhaps no different, people going up there talking about what we care about, what we're passionate about. We always have to keep in mind we're representing over 10 million New Yorkers when we speak up for library aid. That's how many library patrons there are in New York State. So again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening to what we have to say, and we hope you find what we're going to be talking about for the next hour useful as you up your game as a library advocate this advocacy season. So when we talk about the advocacy season, I just wanted to set the stage here to help allow you to see what's kind of going on. It's not just one day in February, Advocacy Day. Advocacy season actually spans from January through June. And Jeremy, I'm hoping you can help unpack this for everyone a little bit to explain what that arc looked like between January and June of this year.
For sure. Each year, our legislature in New York State begins their session in January, and they conclude each year typically in the end of June. That session runs in 2-year chunks in between elections. So we had an election this past November that installed the current elected officials who will serve for both the current year of 2019 and then through all of 2020. And then in the fall of 2020, we will have an election for the folks that will take office in 2021. The sessions, each session is in a 2-year block, but the active part of the session where they're here in Albany working on legislation runs for the half of the year. And the session clearly breaks into 2 distinct portions. The first half of the year is focused almost exclusively on the budget, running from January to when the budget is legally due, April 1st. We've had a rather significant run of now 5 consecutive on-time budgets, which were followed by 2 decades of late budgets. So there's a change in that where the budget is not bleeding into the later part of the session. Once the budget is complete, the legislature then turns their focus to regulatory legislation and spends the remainder of their time in Albany getting policies done. We've seen things be a slightly bit different this year in that right out of the gate, the policy was tackled, and a fair number of important pieces of legislation have already been processed, but they're settling down in now, having cleared the desks of some lingering legislation and are focusing on the budget.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think our next slide here helps people kind of see how you overlay that timeline with the leverage points or pressure points we have to get the word out in the most effective way. Because in my world, I feel like timing is everything.
It is without a doubt, and the date for Library Advocacy Day is very carefully chosen. We are trying to make sure that we're delivering our message as early as possible into the conversation without coming in so early that it's forgotten about when they really get down to business. So the legislature will be on recess next week, as it always is on President's Week, and they come back from that President's Week, and like many a high school senior, realize that they have a big project due April 1st, and it's time to really get down to business. So we're some of the first folks to show up and say we really need to talk about this and talk about our issues relative to the budget before the conversation gets too far down the road and those decisions are starting to be made. That said, the call and the need to participate does not let up because the decisions are not carved in stone until that senior term paper is turned in and the budget is signed and passed off to the governor. Again, that has always come down right to the wire around April 1st, and changes are made literally hours before it is done. So making sure that we're continually reminding folks that no, if you found an error and you need to make up some money somewhere, don't come knocking back at the library budget. We need to make sure that we're in and defending that territory right up to the deadline.
I love how you phrase that, Jeremy, defending our territory. I think that's a really critical tactic when we think about this, keeping the pressure on between now and April 1st. There's a variety of tactics, and we'll touch more on those a little later in the webinar. But when we think about how critical libraries are to people's lives, Jeremy and the staff at NILA have they do polls, Siena polls statewide to test our theories about how important libraries are. And it comes back pretty consistently that most New Yorkers, if not over 90% of New Yorkers, truly believe these statements, that libraries are education. We should be treated like the education component of the budget and not treated like a stepchild in the budget. Libraries are for everyone. We're not a niche organization. Our doors are open to everyone in our communities. And that's something that people really don't always understand. They think we might only be for people of a lower socioeconomic background, only for kids, only for older people. But when you truly take a picture of the cross-section of people who walk through the doors of libraries, it's pretty impressive. And it really drives home the whole idea that more than half of New Yorkers are actively using libraries. Even more than that, actively support libraries from an advocacy standpoint. So one of the key things we're asking for your help with is to surface for legislators just how many of their constituents are library users and supporters. That might be something that surprised them if they themselves are not library users. The other huge talking point that I think would really motivate a lot of educators and legislators to understand libraries at a higher level is the idea that libraries are empowerment engines. We're there to help good stuff happen for the lives of individuals, families, and communities, and honestly, the state at large. So when we talk about libraries, we've got to bust those misconceptions about libraries just being about books. We have to talk about what's going on with the knowledge in those books in our databases, what we're helping people do today in the year 2019. So again, some little more homework for you of getting really good at talking about these three key points that we want to drive home with our legislators. You know, it gets really, I think, boring to talk about some of the nitty-gritty stuff behind the money, but we really do have to have a good understanding of what does library aid actually mean in the state budget. And Jeremy's going to help us unpack this, but we just wanted to show you all of the different sections of what constitutes aid for libraries in the state budget. It hits on so many critical issues that our citizens are faced with here in the state. Libraries of all types and systems of all types are benefiting from the funding that comes through these state aid categories, and that we're able to translate and leverage services in such a way that you could not do as standalone libraries or standalone systems. Jeremy, can you talk a little more about how the $91.6 million is spread across all of these programs?
Sure, and interestingly, that's not even a comprehensive or all-encompassing list of the aid programs. This is a selection of the programs. There's even more lines. We refer to it internally as the Plinko system. We throw the full allocated library aid total in the budget into the system, and it trickles down through a number of different steps before it reaches the individual program lines that go out and support services for all New Yorkers across the state. And there's, as Rebekkah alluded to, it's a very complex and I'll dare say a bit convoluted series of formulas that figure all this out that have been handed to us by the legislature that include percentages. There's some of these programs are based on populations, others are based on other calculations. There's fun in the formulas that hold certain funding levels harmless to a certain date in time, so that even if there's less funding available, they can't be cut below a certain point. So it makes the calculus of figuring out how all the money is sliced and diced a little tricky, which some of you will hopefully then appreciate why it takes a little bit of time for our good friends at the Division of Library Development to figure out, once we know what the total budget number is, how much is actually coming to your library and to your system.
So I think all of that helps us kind of understand why you're not seeing specifically what services are going to be cut should this cut go through. But it does lend itself for you to make sure you understand how this aid impacts services on the front lines of libraries throughout the state. So for example, here in Mid-Hudson, 75% of the system budget comes through state aid support. So when we think about critical services that libraries rely on every day to serve their patrons, from delivery to the integrated library software we use, to our online catalog catalog, to the consultancies we do to make sure boards are complying with laws, to helping directors do the work they do to make sure they're meeting the needs of their community, all of those types of things can be impacted by cuts to library aid. So
And
Jeremy, we understand. Oh, hey, go ahead.
so yeah, and we're looking at a cut. The cut that we're facing down right now from the governor is about 5% of what was in the enacted budget last year. So the budget process works the same each year. The governor takes his first pass. He puts forward his proposal, and then each of the houses of the legislature put forward their own version. So you end up with three competing budgets, and then those three budgets come together, and they need to align them into one finalized document that becomes the enacted budget. So what the governor did in his executive budget for this year is that he took the additional funding that the legislature put into library aid last year and said, no, my number was better, but that amounts to a 5% cut in library aid. His number is 91.6, $5 million less than what was in the enacted budget last year. And so, which we talked about on the previous slide, that 5% doesn't just mean that, okay, it's 5% across the board and we know how that's going to work, because the formulas are there's a lot of complexity there. So it doesn't work out quite cleanly, but it's ballpark. And obviously, where that's going in the wrong direction. There's need for far more funding than is available. This chart has been well worn and shows the entirety of library aid history for the 21st century, and shows all that data broken down into these three clear lines. The blue line that kind of resides in the background shows the education law formula of what education law contemplates the state should be funding library aid at. Works out to $102.6 million, and that formula is census-based, so it's based on the 2010 census, and you can see in 2011 it made that jump based on the adjustment to the new census numbers. The red, what I refer to as the roller coaster line, shows you the trends in the actually enacted library aid over the past several years. And you can see it spiked up in 2007, where for that 1 year, we were actually funded above what was in education law at that point. The real harsh year that we had in 2011 and the cuts there. And as we've slowly tried to make our way back. The green line that makes that steady truck way up and up and up, shows the rate of inflation, where if we take the same dollars that were on the table for us in the year 2000 to have the same buying power for libraries to do the same amount of things that they were doing in 2000, instead of being at what the governor's proposing at 91.6, we would need to be at over $130 million. So we're living the dream of doing more with less, just by virtue of the fact that the dollars that we have allocated to us don't come near to going as far as they did in the past. And the governor's proposed cut comes at the same time while he's proposing a 4.8% increase in funding for the school foundation aid.
That's a very interesting fact there, that the library aid is being cut while school aid is going up, when libraries are part of the education infrastructure, which is something I think we've been fighting about for quite a while. But I think when we really think about the impact that this aid has in our community, something that this chart isn't able to convey is that for every $7, for every $1 in state money that's invested in libraries, we're seeing $7 worth of service being produced from that. So when we think about the decrease in our buying power every single year that we see that chart continue in that same pattern, we're denigrating what really is one of the highest returns on investments that we have in the state when it comes to how state aid is spent. So over a very small part of the state budget, we have a very big impact in how we wisely use the impact into our communities. So again, speaking about how smart we are by working together through the library system infrastructures in our state is a critical talking point when you're speaking to legislators. If they're not using their libraries, they're even further removed from why library systems are important. So making sure you're able to articulate that without your library system, you might not be able to do X, Y, or Z, whatever it might be at your library, is really critical. Here in the Mid-Hudson Library System, we've done the math. We've been able to show our members it would just in one service area, our delivery service, it would cost them $4 million out of pocket to be mailing things among libraries, rather than the cost-effective service that we've been able to produce by leveraging state money and member money to make that happen. That's one of several examples we could give you to help you tell the story of why this money is used incredibly wisely. We were the first organizations in the state doing efficiency plans that suddenly became all the rage a few years ago in the state. And that's something that I don't think we've quite been rewarded for. So never let up in talking about that element of how wise we are in using the money by using the system infrastructure to make local dollars and state dollars go further. So we've got another really big issue looming over us this year we wanted to touch base on. And this is both a short-term and long-term issue that we're contending with. And maybe you've been following issues surrounding the 2020 census, maybe you haven't, but now is definitely the time to tune in and understand how it's going to impact not just our state and our representation in our state, but also state finances. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how a complete count of the 2020 census, so we're coming up on that very, very fast, if we did not have a complete count, that definitely will impact the amount of federal aid that comes into New York State, which means that critical programs that Jeremy's going to mention in a minute are not going to have the same funding behind them from the federal level as they have had traditionally. That therefore means there will be more state dollars going into programs that currently aren't being funded at that level by state dollars, which means less money for programs such as education and library aid in the future. Jeremy, I know you've been studying this very intensely. Can you give the group a good sense of really the impact and also the state's approach to making sure there's a complete count in 2020?
Absolutely. The 2020 census will be the first census in U.S. history that is intended to be completed online. And this new direction at the federal level is projected, they're hoping to save a lot of money for the process of implementing the 2020 census, which the census comes around once every 10 years. The allocation that New York State will receive from the federal government remains to be seen at this point. It'll be in next year's federal budget, but there has been consistent underfunding in the lead-up years at the federal level for the census, which, as Rebekkah alluded to, gives us pause because an undercount will drive so many important factors for the next decade that we need to be working towards that complete count. As the push to move the census online comes, we all in the library community can easily look ahead and see what that means, right? That means that many of the 1 in 5 households that do not have adequate broadband or internet access at home are going to turn to their local library to come and fill out the census and look for assistance from the staff in using the computer. We may have folks coming in that are just not at all computer and digitally literate, and they are wanting to participate in the census, and that's going to require some support. The independent Fiscal Policy Institute has put forward a number of $40 million. That's their recommendation for New York State to fund outreach, right? That's what they're suggesting that the state put forward to just get people aware and willing to participate in the census. And that number's not pulled out of thin air. It's a ballpark number of $2 per person, which is a conservative estimate when there's numbers that based on how hard to count an individual can push that number as high as $75 per person to capture their data for the most hard to count communities. And interestingly, they have looked at the census tract, and there is a public library within 1 mile of every hard to count census tract in the entire country. So based on all of those data points, NYLA is recommending that the state put in a second $40 million, a total of 80, for library-based initiatives. The concept being is that $40 million will go to community-based organizations to get people aware and get them to participate, but we need an equal amount of support for once they cross the threshold. Once they enter the library, we need to be prepared and ready to have a secure connection and the staffing and technology available to support their participation.
So New York State's been calling on community partners for a variety of efforts to come together to do outreach, to promote the count, join complete count committees. But what NYLA is really putting their stamp on is talking about digital literacy initiatives and supporting library staff who are going to perhaps be inundated with people who are coming in, they're nervous about what they have to do. You've got people who don't trust the government, who aren't quite sure they even want to be part of the census. We really have to pull together with other community partners throughout the state to help make a complete count be as close as possible to what we're looking at in terms of our actual population. So this is an unexpected but very hot topic. Unexpected because the governor ended up putting no money in the budget to help with this effort for next year, which everyone is very puzzled by. So when we talked about, Jeremy mentioned people coming through our doors and looking for help on the computers, and you guys experience that all the time. Our facility infrastructure is something we've been struggling with for years here in New York State. In Mid-Hudson alone, 60% of our 66 facilities are not compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're not ADA compliant. That's a very basic element of infrastructure support. So as usual, we are definitely still on the trail of fighting for more money to make sure our library facilities are kept up, that we can be good stewards and actually meet the needs of patrons in 2019 instead of just 1919. So we will be talking more about the investment in library infrastructure. If you have needs in this area, if your building is in dire need of renovation, electrical upgrades, again, accessibility for people with disabilities, energy efficiency issues, these are all things to have photos, stories, talking points about, because legislators really want to hear about this particular issue because it's something that's very visible and they can really see the outcome of the investment they're able to secure for you.
And it's not just us that's talking about that issue. The Division of Library Development has put forward that the accumulated need is almost $2 billion statewide, and the governor's proposal strips back the increase in funding for construction aid that happened last year. I'm sure you're all aware that we saw an increase last year that was, I will admit, a bit of a surprise even to Mike Nepple and I, that it was as robust as it was. It jumped from the governor's proposed $14 million up to $34 million last year, and we thought, wow, that's fantastic. And we were hopeful that the governor might see such a bold statement from the legislature as something that, okay, they really mean this, let's let it be. But no, the governor pushed that $20 million off the table and is back to his $14 million number. So there's a huge number of $20 million that we're looking to hold on to and continue to fund the much needed capital investment that needs to happen in so many libraries.
So as we talked about both state aid for libraries as well as construction aid, these are the numbers put forth by the New York Library Association. Jeremy, can you talk a bit about where these numbers came from?
Sure thing. So the ask for library aid is $200 million this year. And that number probably sounds a little foreign to everyone. It's a different direction than we have gone at any point in the past. The chart that we talked about a few slides back is backward looking. Right? It shows the history of library aid for the entirety of the 21st century. And the governor has been very clear that he's not interested in hearing about anything in the past or how things have happened, and that it's time to just look ahead. So we took those comments to heart and said, you're right, it is time to look ahead. Let's look ahead to what libraries can be for their communities. What could they be accomplishing? We see the potential. We know what the libraries can do. And the thing that's standing in our way is the resources that we need. So we're calling on the legislature to make a bold investment in libraries, to move them forward and to stop looking back at where we've been and look at where we can go. And Absent of that, if they're not willing to hear our calls for moving libraries into the future, at the very least, libraries need to be treated like part of the education infrastructure in New York State that they clearly are, and have an increase in funding that runs parallel to what is in the budget and will inevitably be included in the budget for education aid. And then the other piece of that is that not only are we looking for restoration of what the governor has cut out of construction aid, but we really need a bold investment in the infrastructure as well. And we're calling for a $75 million investment in the public library construction aid program, which, if you recall, the accumulated need is just shy of $2 billion. So this is a drop in the bucket, if you will, against all the capital investment that is needed. And it's not, it's easy to think that the money in the state budget is limitless, and because the numbers are so large. The governor's proposed budget clocks in at $176 billion. That's a number that is so large for me that it really becomes an abstraction. I don't really understand or know what that would look like in a pile or what I would do with that much money. But it's a lot, and the piece of that budget that goes to libraries is less than 0.1% of that entire number. And the library aid program falls within the education portion of the budget. There's very small percentage of the budget that falls into what is discretionary funding. So much of that 176 billion are things that are required, debt service, and so it sounds like there's just gobs of money, and we've had people ask, gosh, why can't we just get them to give us a few $1 million? We're talking we're talking about billions, and we just need these tiny pieces of money. But what's important to remember is that it is a very small piece of that is discretionary, and we are lined up with many other very good organizations that are doing excellent work. But every dollar that comes to libraries is coming out of something else. Someone else is not getting the increase in funding that they're looking for to serve the groups that they're responsible for.
Thank you for that breakdown, Jeremy. I think it's always good to put the money in perspective and break it down to the more local story which people can relate to. That's what we find in local budget campaigns, and I think that same tactic can work at the state level as well. So we want to talk a bit about who you're talking to, because really talking to the right people at the right time is really key right now. And Jeremy talked a bit about the timing of what we need to do. Now we need to talk about who we're actually speaking to. We have to make sure people that we serve understand where the money comes from to make the services they need happen, and to get the word out, to activate your library supporters and your elected officials to make sure they're aware of the issue. There's so much going on in the world today. They need to understand, this little piece of the world that, makes a lot of other things go well. Now is the time to activate people to speak up for library aid. Libraries are for everyone in our communities, which means we have a huge number of people we can activate to speak up on our behalf. Not just your library patrons, but your officials, your elected officials in your towns and your counties who understand the critical role the library plays in supporting goals of localities and counties. So don't be afraid to get out there and ask people to speak up on behalf of libraries. There's an awful lot of people, as we mentioned before. More than half of New Yorkers, 10.6 million New Yorkers, are library card holders. We certainly aren't seeing that many people show up in Albany or use the NYLA Online Advocacy Center, which tells me there's some work to be done at the local level to activate more people to speak up on behalf of libraries. The other thing we wanted to share with you are some results of studies that have been done. So it's not just the library community's voice that's being heard. It's really critical that we hear from people who are not drawing a paycheck from libraries, people who are library patrons, library supporters, citizens in our communities who understand the value of libraries. And the results, frankly, are quite stunning. When you take a look at the results of the Siena polls that NYLA has run over the past few years, 90% of respondents favor an increase in state library funding. That should give you confidence when you're speaking about library aid. Always remember, you're not asking for money for yourself. You are asking for money for the citizens of New York, and 90% of New Yorkers are behind you in that talking point. It's also incredibly important to keep in mind that it's not just NYLA saying that libraries are part of the education infrastructure. That's how we are perceived by New Yorkers. Through this poll that reveals 92% of respondents indicate that public library services are an important part of their local education infrastructure. So people do understand the role that modern libraries are playing. We have to just get way more bold about talking about it and making sure more people are activated to talk about that as well, because New Yorkers definitely put their money where their mouth is, and we all know New Yorkers have big mouths. We've got 94% of local library budget votes passing annually. That's up from 92% a few years ago. And so when you really think about what's behind that people are voting yes to tax themselves more for library services, it really speaks to the deep connection people have with libraries, whether they use them or not. So making sure local voters understand that state money helps to keep local library services affordable is something that might be very motivating to people in your community to speak up at the state level about why state investment in the library infrastructure really matters to people locally. So Jeremy, I'm going to call on you again to help us kind of figure out who's who in Albany, because there's been some huge changes in Albany since last February, and we'd love to make sure everyone's got a sense of who's who and how things are working up there now.
It is a whole new landscape here in Albany, and we can start at the top. Governor Cuomo is still Governor Cuomo and doing all of his Governor Cuomo things. But the Senate is really what's turned upside down. For the first time in a decade, the majority of the senators in New York State are with the Democratic Party, and it's not a razor-thin majority that was held in some of the points in the past. It's a strong majority. And they have collectively named Andrea Stewart-Cousins as the Senate Majority Leader. She is the first woman and the first African-American woman to hold that post, which is exciting. I'm very excited by this because it breaks the other tradition. How many times in New York have you heard the term 3 men in a room, which referred to the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the Assembly and the Governor sequestering themselves to hammer out the final budget deal, those 3 versions of the budget that we mentioned earlier. So the first time in history in New York State, it will not be 3 men. So here's to hoping that Andrea can get things done in new ways. I'm going to skip a bullet for a second, come back to it, but in the Assembly, Carl Heastie is Speaker and has been for a few years now, but we have a new chair for the Assembly Committee on Libraries and Education Technology, and that is Sean Ryan from the Buffalo area. Interestingly, he's a new chair for our committee, and we've seen a lot of committee chairs over the years. People tend to be in this seat for 1 or 2 years. That tends to be the typical term. You'll remember from the Mid-Hudson region, Dee Dee Barrett was most recently in that post, and also from the region, Tom Abenanti was a chair at one point recently as well. Because of the newly implemented pay raises, the Lulus, the additional pay bump that folks get for serving as committee chairs, has been removed from the process. So no committee chairs are getting bonuses anymore, with a few exceptions. So we're hopeful that might take away the reason for so many folks circulating in and out. And I'll jump back up to the Senate Select Committee on Libraries. Some important differences to understand there is that the Select Committee on Libraries is not a standing committee. It needs to be reconstituted each 2-year session. And as we mentioned, this is the beginning of a new 2-year swing. And to date, that committee has not been reestablished. So there is no Select Committee on Libraries in existence at the moment. We are hopeful that will be reconstituted soon. And once that is put in place, they will name a chair from the majority party. So we'll see a Senate Democrat being named as chair of that. Interestingly, the former chair, Republican Senator Patty Ritchie, the Republican caucus named her to the committee, assuming that once it's once it's constituted, she'll be appointed. So things look a lot different in that we have a Democratic control of all three of the legs of the stool, if you will.
So for library people who are excellent at being nonpartisan, this is one of those pro tip moments when it comes to being a library advocate. You do need to pay attention to which party your legislators are affiliated with to understand where influence lies in Albany. So not to hit you over the head with it, but we're hitting you over the head with it. Making sure you see which of the legislators are aligned with the Democrats versus the Republicans gives you a sense of who's going to be very influential in the budget outcome ultimately in April. So that's a big power shift from our historic Republican-controlled Senate that had been carrying the banner for libraries for many years. That means we've got to cultivate new allies in the Democratic Party, and as we understand who's leading key committees, and as we cultivate Ms. Stewart-Cousins to understand where libraries are coming from, this is the work ahead of us right now, is to make sure this leadership shift has that same commitment to libraries that we've always enjoyed from the Republicans. So when we talked about the right people at the right time, we identified those two groups, focusing on your community and your elected officials in Albany. So when you think about the work to be done with your community, they most likely don't understand how libraries are funded in New York. I can almost guarantee you that, because for many years I conducted focus groups throughout the Hudson Valley, and no matter what my goal was with the focus group, I always worked in one question, which was the same in all 250 focus groups I did, which was, do you know how much you pay for library services? And usually the room was split. Some weren't sure, some were very confident they knew. And then I would ask a follow-up question of, okay, tell me how much you pay for library services. And over the course of 10 years, on average, people guess double the amount they actually pay. So they are very disconnected, not only from how much they pay themselves, but how libraries control costs by leveraging state money to help keep the burden on local taxpayers down. So don't be afraid to educate people of how much it costs, how much they personally pay, and how much of a benefit you receive from state dollars that are leveraged at your system to make sure that local library services are affordable. And then don't be afraid, ask them, close the deal. Will they speak up for libraries? If they believe, hopefully they'll speak up. If they're not comfortable being a public speaker, come into Albany with us. We've got a variety of other ways for them to help, whatever their talents lie as an advocate. On the other side of the aisle here, we've got your elected officials in Albany. You got to get to know them. We've got a lot of new legislators out there, particularly here in the Hudson Valley. We saw a huge turnover in the last election, which means we have a lot of legwork to do to make sure people get to know us, we get to know them, we understand what their priorities are, and they understand how what libraries do align with their priorities for their constituents. So always remember that one message doesn't fit all audiences. Get to know who you're speaking to, what they care about, and frame your message in a way that speaks pretty closely to what they're trying to accomplish in their district and why they were elected. That's what they think they're there to do, is what their messages was during their campaigns. That's what their mind is set on carrying out in the next few months. We need to make the case of how libraries help them do the work they're trying to accomplish in their local districts. So we've talked a lot about the budget, and Jeremy made the timeline clear here. We're in kind of go mode on the budget between now and April 1st. But after April 1st, the attention of the legislature is going to switch into some of the legislative priorities they are trying to pass. And the library community has some legislative priorities they want to see accomplished over the course of this advocacy season that we're dealing with, that will run from April till June is when you'll see more action on the legislative side. But we have to start planting seeds now to make sure we're getting the traction we need to get the attention we need to make sure action actually occurs on our legislative priorities. There's 3 legislative priorities for the New York Library Association's community this season, and Jeremy's going to introduce them to us.
First and foremost, we're looking for a bill that will guarantee the students' right to a school librarian and school libraries. This bill has been around for, sadly, decades. And what is important to know is that right now in education regulations, and there's a difference between regulations put forward by the Education Commissioner and education law, but the education regulations stipulate that there should be a school librarian in grades 7 through 12 for essentially high schoolers. There is no requirement at all for a school librarian in grades K through 6, even though there have been a multitude of studies that show an impact. One that showed that fourth graders on their statewide tests were scoring 15 to 20% higher in schools where there was a school librarian. So the impact is known. So what we're looking to accomplish is to not only expand the regulation all the way down to kindergarten and make it a K-12 regulation, but also to codify the regulation in education law so that it is completely enforceable. And not only do we need to make this a regulatory and legal requirement, but we are looking for the legislature to find ways to provide funding to support it. The next item on the agenda is of most interest to our friends in the academic library community, and it's transparent contracting with educational institutions. Boiled down, what this stipulates is that when an academic library is purchasing electronic resources, most typically databases, there is a common practice right now for the vendors to insert an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, that stipulates that part of the terms of their contract is that that librarian, that library director, is not permitted under the terms of the contract to disclose what they paid for the product to anyone else. If you can imagine going to the store and buying a loaf of bread, but the price isn't posted and none of your neighbors, no one else who is purchasing bread is allowed to tell you what they paid for bread, so that when you walk in, the market can decide what they're charging for that based on each person who walks through the door and what they think that you are able to pay. Clearly not in alignment with the values of an open market. So we're calling on the legislature to address this and make a non-disclosure agreement and a legal requirement within contracts with institutions that are using public dollars to purchase these resources. And the last of our three heavy priorities for policy is universal access to the State Library Aid Construction Program. What we're looking to do is, at the very least, retain the current match option, and boiled down, that stipulates that the cost of a construction aid program, that the locality needs to come up with at least 25% of the overall program cost, project cost, to match what is provided by the state. That provision is set to sunset in 2020, and we're looking to ensure that that stays in place. In addition to that, as we're addressing that sunset, we're looking to make the program more accessible, particularly by some of the smallest libraries, by lowering the match requirement for those that are identified at the system level as needing additional assistance down to 10% of the total project cost, so that that small library that needs a new roof can maybe hold 2 less bake sales to try and come up with their portion of the project.
So as you can see, we've got our work cut out for us people this year. We've got a lot going on and a lot of people we need to educate very quickly about the needs of library aid and library construction aid in our communities. So I just want to remind everyone that you're not just encouraged to speak up, you're also allowed to speak up. We got a lot of questions last year after this webinar if it was okay for library directors and staff to be speaking up about these issues. And the answer is absolutely. As long as you're providing factual information to your people, your patrons, your community members, making sure they understand the facts surrounding how library aid from the state level impacts your local budget, that's absolutely fine to do. If you want to go even further on your free time and be working on social media and be doing tweet outs and coming to lobby day, or advocacy day rather, that's all cool too. So don't be afraid to speak up. If you don't do it, probably nobody else is going to. So thanks for being here today. We want to give you a lot of resources to make sure you've got what you need to feel supported as you do this work over the next few weeks and months. You've got talking points that are available through NYLA.org. That's Jeremy's organization's website, NYLA.org/advocacy. You also have talking points coming out of the Sustainability Initiative initiative of the New York Library Association that speaks about the more holistic issues surrounding library aid in our communities and what libraries in the 21st century are up to. So the talking points at the /advocacy URL speak to the specifics about the budget, about digital literacy, the census, the 3 pieces of legislation. The talking points you'll find at the /sustainability link, you're going to be talking about how libraries are contributing to a stronger economy in general, how we're contributing to economic and environmental stewardship and fiscal responsibility, as well as social equity issues. So you've got a lot to choose from, and you need to read it all and make it your own so it's coming out of your mouth naturally. Don't feel like you have to read word for word what you're saying there, but it's a place for you to get more words that will help you craft messages that work for you and the particular audience that you're talking to. So here are some of your tips for you, right? We just talked about studying the talking points. Go ahead and visit your legislator's website and get to know them, particularly if you've got a brand new legislator. Check out what committees they're on, what press releases they're issuing, what their Facebook and Twitter feeds reveal about what they're most interested in right now. That will really help you out. Go ahead and gather those local statistics and stories, particularly about how state aid that comes through your system benefits your local library. Tons of information are coming out from all systems across the state to help you tell that story. And I bet you've got a lot of stories of your own about how your system makes your library successful. So if you're coming to Advocacy Day, or you're making a phone call to a legislator, or you're stopping by a local office for a visit, make sure you have an anecdote or two in mind. Just like we said, talking about how your system supports your library, how kids benefit from the summer reading program, how someone found a job at the library thanks to assistance from your staff. Whatever it might be that you think is going to be a sticky story. And what I mean by that is a really memorable story, something that when you tell it, people lean in and listen. They want to hear how that story ends. Those are the kinds of things to be working on and crafting when you're speaking to your legislators or writing to your legislators or writing a letter to the editor. These are the human stories that actually bring the dollars home. As Jeremy mentioned, when you're talking about billions of dollars in the state budget, millions of dollars in a library aid ask, those things are hard for local people to relate to because their household budgets don't reach those levels, that's for sure. But they do relate when you talk to things about how it actually relates to their household budget. So in a minute, we're going to talk about the Real People, Real Dollars campaign, which can really translate these big numbers into very relatable numbers. You've got the opportunity to participate in person at Advocacy Day in local offices, on the phone by calling your legislators' offices in both Albany and their local offices, as well as online through the New York Library Association's online advocacy center, and by connecting with your legislators through social media on Twitter and Facebook. And Jeremy, something I know I've learned when Mike came on, your government relations person, he really challenged the library community, noting that numbers matter. Can you talk more about that?
They sure do. Every elected official is, committed to doing the best for their constituents, for the districts that they represent. And truthfully, they're particularly interested in those folks who are vocal, because the vocal folks are the ones that they know are going to show up at the ballot box. And, most of the folks that are in elected office are interested in staying in elected office, which means they need to get reelected. So keeping their most vocal constituents happy is how they accomplish that. And we need to make sure that they're hearing from the community that the library funding and library issues are important to them as much as we absolutely possibly can. And they do absolutely keep track of how many emails they get, how many phone calls they get, and how many visits they get. There's a staffer responsible in every office for keeping track of these things and reporting on, what's hot, what are we getting the most calls on this week.
And we all know numbers matter on Advocacy Day too. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about Advocacy Day.
Yeah, it's my favorite day of the year, without a doubt, because we get folks from every corner of the state that get up in the dark of the early morning and board a bus to come to Albany and just give a day out of their lives away from their families and their work to come and participate in the democratic process, to let the folks that they've elected to represent them here in Albany know how important library issues are. And it really is a numbers game. It's for many of you, maybe the only time that you set foot in the legislative office building in the course of 2019. So you'll have to take my word for it. But Our showing there on the 27th is not a unique opportunity or a unique occurrence. It's not that every other day of the week that space sits empty. There's a group in the day after and the day after that and the day before. It's continuously inundated with folks coming and doing the same work we're doing. And our job is to make sure that we have even more folks and we have a showing that really runs circles around so many of the other groups that are there. And we have set a high watermark in 2018. We had some of the largest crowds we've ever had in 2018. So we're excited for 2019 and encourage all of you on the line to reach out and encourage others to join you. This is not going to be a slam dunk year. It's not a process of just, yep, the legislature will put back what the governor cut like they have the last couple of years, because the folks that have been protecting us in the past are not there, and the lift now, the cuts, the increases were so significant this year that the cuts are so much more significant. So even just getting to flat funding is going to take a tremendous amount of work. So we need everyone to come. So grab your friends and your family and get them on a bus.
So we know that people are not only logged in here today from the Mid-Hudson region, but that statewide people will be watching this webinar, and there's plenty of help to get you to Albany. We know some people, especially in our region, like, oh, but the parking in Albany, a lot of systems work together to make sure that we can get you there in style. Mid-Hudson, we work with another library system to make sure we have buses coming up the thruway. So regardless of your region of the state, check out what your system's up to help you get to Albany and make it fun. You guys know we've got Kirsten, our bus captain, and she makes Lobby Day a lot of fun for all of us. So taking the bus is often a great way to get there. It takes a lot of the stress out of the day. It costs as much to ride the bus in this region as it does to park up there. So you might as well kick back and relax and have some snacks with Kirsten. But once you get there, there's a couple of pro tips we want to share with you because it can be an exciting day. You're there with literally hundreds, if not 1,000 other library advocates who are walking the halls of the concourse, of the Legislative Office Building, of the Capitol Building. And here are some hard-won tips. Jeremy, can you walk us through this?
The first one is a good one for every single day, but it's super duper important on Library Advocacy Day, and it's wear comfortable shoes. It's always great to be stylish, but you're going to put on a lot of steps. You'll get your steps in that day. So be comfortable. Be prepared to go through airport-like security when you get down towards the Legislative Office Building. It is not the TSA, it's state troopers there that will be scanning your bags and taking you through the x-ray. So be ready for that. As you move through the meetings, don't be afraid to speak up. We'll make sure that everyone hopefully can join us for the rally. We have an indoor protest that happens at noon in the Legislative Office Building, and we make a lot of noise, and the crowds are addressed by several members of the legislature, so it's a chance to see your elected official if you didn't get a chance to see them in the meetings that you participated in. And that last bullet point, boy, can't be said enough. As you meet with everyone, make sure you're inviting them to come back and see you in your library. Oh boy. There's a YouTube video out there, and we'll make sure we share the link with folks that literally shows you exactly what you will see. It was shot just last year, and you get to watch my lovely mug take you through the process of where the bus is going to drop you off. That's Madison Avenue, and you can see behind me is the New York State Museum. That's where you're going to get off the bus on Advocacy Day. We'll take you through the process of making your way all the way through the concourse, through security, and into the Legislative Office Building. So if you're a visual person like me and you want to see what you're going to see, and it'll be like familiar, like you've already been there, you can give up 6 minutes and 30 seconds of your life and pre-live it.
It's a very enjoyable watch. Thanks for making that video, Jeremy. So we know not everyone can make it to Advocacy Day, and a lot of you might be coming, but a lot of your team can't make it there. So we want to encourage you to pick up the phone. I know that seems weird in an age of texting and social media, but the phone does make an impression. We love it when we are in our appointments in Albany in the Legislative Office buildings, and the phones are ringing off the hook with library supporters calling. Nothing better than a harried secretary in one of those offices being like, would you guys please stop? So if you can't make it, please do call on Advocacy Day to the Albany offices and encourage other people to do so as well. We've also got online advocacy tools, which Jeremy makes super easy for everyone to use. There's already a pre-drafted letter, so you could use the language that's there, or you could edit it to put in a local point, or if you know your legislator, to make it a little more personal than the language that you'll see there. But seriously, it takes less than, I don't know, I think I timed myself last time, 3 minutes to fill in my name, edit the letter a little bit, and send it on to a lot of really important people in Albany who need to have those numbers to understand more people want them to be speaking up about library aid. The other thing we want to encourage you to do is make sure you're tagging NYLA and Library Advocacy Day for 2019 when you're tweeting and posting on Facebook about the need to be advocates, about your experience while you're advocating, and particularly if you're at Advocacy Day, to connect with other people who are doing the work that you're doing, and also to make sure legislators see the activity around library advocacy as much as possible. Some of us are better than this at others, and if you feel like you're not that good at it, that's okay, but it might be a cool way for you to practice tagging things and posting pictures and making sure we're putting a face on the words of library advocacy. You see a lot of articles and posts on statewide listservs about Advocacy Day, but when you get to that rally and hundreds of librarians and library supporters are yelling and chanting for libraries, that's something that we have to surface so other people in the state can see is actually happening. We also want to encourage people to participate in the Real People, Real Dollars program. This has been highly successful both in the Mid-Hudson Library System and around the state over the past 2 years. This is what we were talking about before. How do you translate the dollar value to a local patron in using their library? When you think about how much money people save by using their library compared to how much they pay in taxes towards their library, the return on investment is very easy to sell when you can see it in this way. So if you're looking for more information on how to do this, you can visit the NYLA's website for advocacy tools to learn more about the Real People, Real Dollars campaign. For public libraries, this is a really good way to not only tell the story at the state level, but also the local level when you're getting ready for your local library budget votes. So NYLA also makes it easy to tweet on behalf of library advocacy at their advocacy tools section at nyla.org/advocacy. You've got cut and paste tweets with the hashtags already built in. So if you're lazy like I am, you can just cut and paste those right into Twitter and get some leverage on the library advocacy end of things. Be sure to tag your legislators. They are watching, their staff is watching. Don't think they're not just because they don't respond to you. So if you haven't gotten a sense in the hour that we've been chatting so far this morning, now is the time to be doing this work. If you haven't done your calls, if you haven't done your online messages, if you haven't have a plan for Advocacy Day, now is the time to figure that out and to inspire other people to do so as well. Remember, you are highly influential in your library and in your community and among your peers. So let them know you care about this and you know what you're doing and that you can help them connect with these resources too. This is the crunch time for library advocacy. And if you don't step up, nobody else is going to. So thank you for being here today. We wanted to put your resource links in front of you one more time where you can get a lot of good stuff. NYLA staff does such good work to make sure we're prepared for advocacy season. So take advantage of all the hard work they've put in to the talking points, the online advocacy center, and those virtual advocacy resources if you can't make it to Albany on the 27th and beyond. So we just want to end by reminding you that one person can make a difference and everyone should try, just like JFK said. That still rings true, particularly in today's world. So again, thank you for joining us today. It really does warm our hearts to see you take the time to learn more about this because we need all hands on deck to help out with the situation this year. So thank you. And please spread the word of what's going on in Albany for library aid. It really does make a difference when you speak up. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time. Do you have a few minutes to hang out if anyone has questions?
I certainly do, and thank you and Mid-Hudson for the opportunity and leading this webinar.
Our pleasure.